So, the first question we should answer is, how do we define the Bible's overall story? Here's what I would suggest. I would say the Bible's story focuses on God's purpose to rescue his creatures from sin so they can fulfill their vocation of imaging God to the world. Now, I know that's a long sentence, so I'll repeat it and we'll return to it throughout this discussion. Try to, just reinforce how we see this story throughout the Bible. But once again, the Bible's story focuses on God's purpose to rescue his creatures from sin so they can fulfill their vocation of imaging God to the world. That is where the Bible's story focuses. So which passages bring this to the forefront? And what we're trying to do here is not just make this statement, state this thesis, and then cherry pick from the Bible statements that support it. Rather, these passages I'm going to read, what I want us to be able to see is that these are at the forefront of the Bible's narrative development. That this is the spine, so to speak. And these passages themselves suggest that this is central to the Bible's message and to what God is doing in the world. So let's start with the Old Testament and ask ourselves, what is God's purpose for humanity according to the Old Testament? I mean, if the Bible story is God rescuing us so we can fulfill this purpose, let's start by answering the question, what is this purpose? Now, full disclosure, I'm going to lean heavily throughout this discussion on the work of G.K. Beale. I've already quoted him once. He's just an expert in tracing the Bible's storyline and how that storyline comes to fulfillment in the New Testament. So if you're a fan of Beale or read his works, you'll probably hear that coming through in a lot of this conversation. But let's start with Genesis 1, verses 27 and 28, in order to answer the question, what is God's purpose for humanity? Well, we read in Genesis 1, so God created humans in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. We read here that Adam and Eve are created in God's image, and they are told to fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over it. So human kingship, that's what's meant by the language of having dominion and subduing and ruling. Humans are to be kings in God's creation. And this kingship is a functional result of being made in God's image. We read there, God made humans in his image and said to them, be fruitful, multiply, and have dominion. So this dominion is a functional result of being made in God's image. Now, by the way, I don't think that exhausts what it means to be made in God's image. And there's just been lots of discussion in the history of theology over what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God. I'm not saying this exhausts it, but this is one essential element of it. To be made in the image of God is to be made to have dominion over the earth. Now, this not only is a theological truth, but it also connects with certain ancient ways of understanding kings and how they function in their empire. So the Bible being written in the context of the ancient Near East uses a lot of those categories to help communicate its message. And so ancient Near Eastern kings would often build images of themselves and put them in parts of their territory to represent their presence and rule. If you were far away from the home base of the king, the capital, so to speak, you might find an image in the territory as a way of saying, this territory, though far from home, is still under the dominion of this king. He owns it and he governs it. And you subjects need to do what he says. Well, that idea connects very directly to the idea of God making Adam and Eve in his image and placing them in his garden, in his world. They are his image bearers and are to signify to the world God's kingship. They're to bring God's kingship to God's creation. Furthermore, God making them and placing them in the garden signifies that this garden will be a place where God's presence is known. In other words, this garden will be a temple. Where do you find the image of the divine? You find it in the divine's temple. And so this garden was to be a temple, and we can deduce from that God's presence was to expand from that temple and fill the whole earth. That's why God made humans, to be his image bearers and to fill his creation with his image. Now let's say then a little bit more about what that image constitutes. Adam and Eve were to reflect the moral attributes of God in God's creation. I'm going to read you 2 verses from the New Testament, and I want you to listen for the language of image and likeness as I read these. And if you're familiar with the Westminster Confession of Faith and its discussion of the image of God, these will sound familiar. But Ephesians 4:24 reads, "And to clothe yourselves with the new self, created according to the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness." How does Ephesians describe the likeness of God and the creational image of God in terms of true righteousness and holiness? And likewise, Colossians 3:10 reads as follows, "And have clothed yourselves with the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of its creator." So once again, now new creation imagery, and we'll get to the role of that soon, but being used to explain the renewal of the image of God in humans, and defined here in terms of knowledge. So knowledge, true righteousness, and holiness are just 3 ways in which the New Testament defines for us the image of God. And so we can conclude from that the image of God in humans refers very strongly, if not primarily, to their moral attributes, to the way in which they reflect the moral nature of God. That Christian virtue is the way in which God is seen among his people and in his creation. And I'm suggesting that these are primary because maybe you noticed as I read those New Testament scriptures, they didn't use the language of dominion, that they focused on the language of image and the language of virtue. So one could argue that what God primarily wants us to bring to the creation is virtue, is morality. To be, and I don't mean by that moralism or any downplaying of justification, not at all. Just the sense that the sanctification process in us makes us like God, and that's how God is seen in God's creation. So if you want to, situate that now with reference to dominion, you could almost argue the dominion that we exercise is that of virtue. That Christians are not called to great power or to be in charge, but to show God to the world by means of their virtue, their renewal in God's image. That is what God wants to be brought to his world. So Adam and Eve are to reflect the moral nature of God. That's why God created humans. That whole that God's nature, the attributes of God that we can share in, that we can reflect, would go out in his world by means of his people. So just as God subdued the chaos and then created the earth, and that's how God ruled over the earth, so Adam and Eve will continue God's work by subduing and having dominion over the earth by filling it with God's glory and God's virtue.